Have you ever watched someone strip away a child's identity, all in the name of discipline? In a world that often demands we fit in, what happens when staying true to ourselves means standing alone? Today's story isn't just about a haircut. It's about power, silence, and the quiet fire that awakens when enough is enough. If you've ever faced injustice or watched someone you love be punished for being different, this story will strike a chord. Watch to the end for a powerful lesson in dignity, courage, and presence. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true stories that matter. The morning light filtered through the high windows of Orlando Academy, painting long golden streaks across the marble floors. The building, with its grand columns and silent halls, had the air of a museum more than a school. Most of the students walked with rehearsed grace, their steps quiet, their backs straight, like they were on display. For them, this place wasn't just about learning, it was a statement, a polished resume of refinement, talent, and conformity. But Emma Norris was different. She didn't move like she was trying to impress anyone. She carried herself with quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need approval to feel whole. Her silver-white hair shimmered under the sunlight. Most thought she dyed it to stand out. In truth, it had been that way since she was a child, a rare trait passed down from her grandmother. Her father always said it made her look like moonlight had chosen her. Emma loved painting. Not landscapes or portraits like most of her classmates. She painted strange, vivid dreamscapes. Entire worlds blooming out of cracked staircases, birds flying through shattered mirrors, oceans spilling from the eyes of stone statues. Her work didn't always win awards, but it always made people stop and stare. That, to her, was enough. Her studio corner in the back of the school's art wing was where she felt most alive. The smell of paint, the quiet hum of classical music from an old speaker, the scratch of pencil on canvas. It was her safe place. Her mother had passed when she was 7, and since then her art had been her way of speaking to the world, her way of remembering, her way of processing everything that never made sense out loud. That morning, Emma arrived early. She set up her brushes, unrolled a canvas, and began outlining a new piece. It was a simple sketch. A girl walking alone on a road of clocks, each ticking a different rhythm. She didn't know what it meant yet. That was part of her process, letting the painting tell her what it needed to become. But peace never lasts long when you stand out in places that prize uniformity. Her class that day was an open critique session. Students displayed their latest projects, while teachers and visiting artists walked through offering feedback. Some students were visibly nervous. Others played the game with charm, using buzzwords they'd picked up from art books or documentaries. Emma simply stood by her canvas, quietly waiting. Then came Professor Zane Huxley. He wasn't just another teacher. He was the gatekeeper of prestige at Orlando, a man with connections to every major art school on the East Coast. Tall, lean, and always dressed like he'd just walked off the stage of a European opera house, Huxley had a sharp eye and a sharper tongue. His praise was rare, his criticism was often cruel. He paused in front of Emma's painting. His eyes scanned the canvas, his lips curled. "This feels untethered," he said, flicking his wrist toward the image. "A bit indulgent. Like you're painting your dreams without asking if they deserve to be shared." Emma felt a tightness in her chest, but she didn't react. She was used to Huxley's style. Many students were. But then he turned to her and asked flatly, "Have you ever considered toning down your look? That hair. It's distracting. It pulls focus from the work." She blinked, for a moment unsure if she heard him right. "It's just hair," she replied quietly. He gave a half smile. "In art, everything is a message. Even when we don't mean it to be. You should learn to curate more intentionally." The room went still. No one spoke. No one stepped in. The next day, Emma found a note in her locker. It was written in clean block letters. Required meeting, Studio 2C, noon, Professor Huxley. She wasn't surprised. He had made it clear he had more to say. She entered Studio 2C at exactly noon. It was empty, except for Professor Huxley and his assistant, Miss Cleary. On the table lay a folded cape, a pair of scissors, and a small box of black hair dye. "Let's begin," he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Emma stepped back. Her heart pounded. "Begin what?" "The reframe," he replied. "You need a neutral presence if you want your work to speak louder than your appearance." She shook her head. "You're not serious." Huxley stepped forward. "I'm very serious, Miss Norris. You have two choices. Conform and continue, or resist and leave." Miss Cleary didn't look at her. She simply unfolded the cape and held it open. Emma felt the room closing in. Her hands trembled. "This is wrong." Huxley's tone didn't change. "Sometimes art requires sacrifice. It's not always pleasant." Then, before she could move, he reached forward and began to cut. A sharp slice. A handful of silver hair floated to the floor. Emma gasped, jerking back. But the second cut came faster, then another. By the time she found the breath to speak again, it was too late. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. He stepped back, observing his work like it was just another canvas. "Better," he muttered. "Now the real Emma can begin." She walked out of the room in silence, her hands clenched, her face was pale, her head is uneven and raw. Students turned to stare as she passed. Some whispered, some looked away. She reached the courtyard, sat on the cold stone bench beneath the old oak tree, and pulled out her phone. Her father picked up after the first ring. She didn't need to say much, just a few broken words. "They cut my hair. Said I had to. I said no. They did it anyway." There was silence on the line. Then, Chuck's voice. Calm, steady. "Don't move, I'm coming." She nodded, though he couldn't see. "Okay." He didn't ask who, he didn't ask how, he didn't need details. He only said one thing before the line went dead. "No one touches what they don't understand." And just like that, something shifted. Emma didn't know it yet, but the storm had begun. Not the kind that makes noise, the kind that changes everything. Chuck Norris had spent the better part of the last decade far away from attention. He didn't care for cameras, stage lights, or public stages anymore. Fame had come early in his life, but peace, real peace, took years to find. He had carved it out for himself and his daughter in a quiet corner of the world, deep in the pines where the only voices he heard were wind, birds, and his own thoughts. He was finishing his morning routine when the call came. Not a loud moment, no panic, just the steady vibration of a phone across an oak table, and a father's instincts rising like a tide. He knew her voice even when it trembled. "They cut my hair," she said. He didn't ask who, he didn't ask how. He heard everything he needed to in the silence between her words. His hands, weathered from years of training and time, folded the knife he'd been using to trim a branch. He stood, no wasted movement, no wasted emotion. Emma wasn't the kind of child who cried easily. She had been through too much to break from something small, which meant this wasn't small. He pulled on a canvas jacket, grabbed the keys from a bowl by the door, and walked out into the cool mountain air. The drive from the forest to Orlando Academy took just under 2 hours. Chuck didn't rush. He didn't blast through traffic or call ahead. He moved the way storms moved, when they didn't need permission. At the edge of the city, he pulled into a small gas station. He cleaned the dust off the windshield and checked his watch. He wasn't late. He was never late when it mattered. The academy sat at the top of a hill. Elegant stone walls, perfect landscaping. Uniformed staff walking with measured steps. The kind of place built to impress those who believed that reputation was the same thing as value. Chuck parked the truck across the street. He didn't care for the valet signs. He didn't bother locking the door. As he stepped out, a student riding past on a scooter slowed down. The boy looked once, then again. He didn't know who Chuck was, but he felt something shift in the air. Chuck's presence was like that. He didn't fill a room with noise. He filled it with gravity. He walked across the courtyard, heading straight toward the main entrance. His eyes scanned the building not as a tourist, but as a man reading the history of every brick. Inside, the receptionist looked up, startled. She began to speak but stopped before finishing the sentence. He wasn't being rude, he just wasn't asking. "I'm here for my daughter," he said, calm, low, like gravel soaked in calm water. Before she could offer a pass or ask a name, he was down the hallway. Students stepped aside instinctively. Teachers turned without knowing why. Emma sat alone on a bench near the library. Her shoulders were curled forward. A knit beanie covered her head, but even beneath it he could tell she didn't feel like herself. She looked up and saw him, and for the first time since yesterday, her breath came a little easier. He sat beside her, didn't say much, just placed a steady hand over hers. "Let me see," he said softly. She hesitated, then reached up and pulled the beanie off. What remained of her hair was uneven. Some patches were shaved close to the scalp, others are still clinging to strands that refused to fall. She didn't cry, but her eyes spoke for her. He took a long breath, not in anger, in purpose. "Who did this?" he asked. She looked down. "Professor Huxley." Chuck nodded, then stood. "Wait here," he said, and she did. The hallway toward the administrative wing was long, lined with plaques, photos, and quotes in gold script, but Chuck didn't look at any of it. He had no need to read the words of people who weren't present. Professor Huxley's office door was slightly open. The man sat at his desk, sipping a small cup of tea and reviewing a stack of student portfolios. He didn't look up right away when Chuck entered, but he felt it. That pause in the air, that cold shift in the room's temperature. Huxley raised his head. His expression changed. Not fear exactly, but the uncertainty of someone who realized they no longer had control. "Can I help you?" he asked. Chuck closed the door behind him. "You laid your hands on my daughter." Huxley straightened. His voice took on a professional tone. "We followed school procedure. There was a violation of uniform appearance, and we—" Chuck's voice interrupted him, low and even. She said, "No." There was a long silence. "We operate under the standards of the academy," Huxley replied. "These standards are clear. Students are informed upon entry." Chuck stepped closer. "Did you listen when she spoke? Did you ask if she felt safe?" Professor Huxley placed his cup down. "This is a professional environment. I expect calm discussion, not threats." Chuck looked him straight in the eye. "What you call professional is a mask for arrogance. You believe uniformity equals order, but what you did was humiliating. That's not discipline, that's domination." Huxley opened his mouth to reply, but Chuck continued. "You don't get to strip away someone's identity because you don't understand it. You don't get to cut pieces of a person to fit your idea of beauty." Outside the office, a few staff members had begun to gather. No one said anything, but the tension in the hall was thick. Chuck stepped back. He looked around the room. "I trained fighters to stay calm under pressure. I taught soldiers to read a battlefield before it erupted. And I've learned one truth again and again." He paused. Silence, in the face of injustice, is the seed of rot. Then he opened the door and walked out. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't slam anything, but everyone knew something had shifted. By the time he reached the main office, 2 students had pulled out their phones. They weren't filming, just texting. Word had spread. Within an hour, a message had reached the superintendent's office. By mid-afternoon, the district lawyer was on the way. Emma sat in the garden behind the library. Her fingers traced the edge of a sketchbook, though she wasn't drawing. Chuck returned and sat beside her. "You okay to go home?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah." He looked at her hands, still shaking a little. He offered her his jacket. It was old, a little faded, but it smelled like the mountains and cedarwood. She put it on, and for the first time since yesterday she smiled. Small, but real. They walked out of the school together. No one blocked their path. As they reached the steps, Chuck placed a hand gently on her back. "Every step forward is yours now," he said. She looked at the sky, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel so heavy. Back home, Chuck built a fire. Emma sat nearby, watching the flames shift and crackle. She didn't ask what would happen next. She knew. When a line is crossed, Chuck doesn't speak to punish. He acted to protect. And when protection reveals injustice, the next step isn't reaction. It's a transformation. That night, as Emma went to bed, Chuck pulled out a folder he hadn't touched in years. Inside were old files, letters and emails, not about him, but about others. Stories of students, young artists, marginalized voices who had whispered the same things Emma had now shouted. He had heard rumors before, but now he had proof. And the truth? It doesn't stay quiet for long. This wasn't just about one girl and a haircut. This was about what happens when people in power confuse authority with permission. And when one voice finally says no, others find the courage to speak. Chuck had never believed in going public with personal matters. For most of his life, he'd handled things the old-fashioned way, quiet conversations, direct actions, dignity first, noise last. But this time, something was different. It wasn't just about Emma. It was about something far deeper. A system that had stopped listening and started deciding, all on its own, who deserved to be heard. At dawn, he stood in his workshop, a small cabin separate from the main house. On one wall hung photographs, not of him, but of people he admired, teachers, mentors, men and women who had shaped others, not through punishment, but by calling out their greatness. He sat at his workbench, opened his old leather-bound notebook, and flipped to a page he hadn't touched in years. It was a list. Names, dates, and short notes. Students. Some were artists, other athletes. A few just kids who'd tried to be themselves in places that didn't allow it. He had started keeping that list after attending a school board meeting 8 years ago, where a mother stood and spoke, her voice shaking, about how her son had been told to stop wearing traditional patterns from his tribe during school presentations. The boy was suspended. Chuck hadn't known what to say at the time, but he remembered, and he started writing things down, just in case. Now, with Emma's story added to the top, the list no longer felt like a collection of moments. It felt like a pattern, a thread of control masked as structure, of systems pretending to teach while quietly demanding silence. He spent the next few days in deliberate motion, not in anger, in clarity. He contacted 3 former students from Orlando. They had grown now. One lived in Chicago working as a graphic designer. Another had opened a community gallery in Oakland. The third had stopped creating altogether, now managing a bookstore near Denver. Each had their own version of the same story. Creative expression is stifled. Personal identity is labeled as a distraction. All of them remembered Professor Huxley. One of them had saved a letter. A written note from Huxley, critiquing her portfolio and suggesting she abandon painting entirely. He called it emotionally cluttered, said her work lacked universal form. Chuck asked if they would be willing to speak. Not for him, for themselves. One by one they agreed. He didn't call the media first. Instead, he requested a meeting with the school board. He had no title, no affiliation. just a man with a voice and a daughter who deserved better. The board chair tried to postpone. Chuck declined. He simply showed up. The meeting room was small, beige walls, a long table, coffee in white paper cups, the kind of place where policy is discussed but rarely changed. He stood at the far end, with no slides and no notes. Just a small folder and a steady tone. He told them what had happened. Then he opened the folder. Inside were testimonies, not long speeches, just printed paragraphs. Words from students who had felt erased in the name of Polish. Statements like, "I was told my work was too dark," or "I was encouraged to choose a more neutral theme for my senior project because my life experience might make others uncomfortable." Chuck didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He asked one question. If a place of learning requires erasing who you are to be accepted, what exactly are we teaching? No one answered, but no one looked away either. By the time he left the room, the superintendent had asked for copies. The board chair requested a follow-up, but Chuck wasn't waiting on them. He'd already begun something else. Emma had gone back to painting, quietly, in the early mornings. She didn't speak much about what happened, but Chuck noticed the difference. Her lines were sharper, her colors are bolder. It was like she wasn't painting for the classroom anymore, she was painting for herself. One afternoon, she asked him what was going to happen next. Chuck smiled slightly. "That depends," he said. "Do you want to be done with this, or do you want to help others not go through it?" She didn't even hesitate. "I want it to mean something." That was all he needed to hear. Together, they drafted a simple message. Not a press release, just a letter, open and honest, signed by both of them. It told the story plainly and ended with a question. How many others have stayed quiet because they thought no one would believe them? They posted it online, no hashtags, no dramatic headlines, just a message to whoever needed it. Within 24 hours, Chuck's inbox was full. Teachers, parents, former students, each with a story. Many thanks, Emma. A few sent photos of their own children holding paintings, poems, and songs they'd once been told to change. Then, a former Orlando student reached out with something different. A recording. It was old, taken from a phone during a closed critique session years ago. In it, Huxley could be heard telling a student that art without restraint was indulgent noise, and that individuality needed to be tamed to be marketable. The voice was clear, the room was silent, and no one had pushed back. Chuck listened twice, then forwarded it to the board. He didn't say anything else. That night, he called in a favor. Clint Eastwood wasn't a man of many words. He didn't need to be. When Chuck told him what had happened, Clint didn't offer sympathy, he offered presence. He flew in quietly, with no cameras, no press. He met Chuck at a diner on the edge of town, ordered black coffee, and listened. When the story was done, Clint asked one thing. "What's your end game?" Chuck thought for a moment. "I want the truth to have a louder voice than the silence ever did." Clint nodded. "Then let's make sure it echoes." They met with Emma the next morning. She showed Clint one of her new paintings. He studied it for a while, then said something simple. "You don't need permission to be exactly who you are." Emma smiled. At that moment, Chuck saw something shift again. Not in her art, in her posture, in her voice. She wasn't just recovering, she was growing. Word spread that Clint was in town. The school board scheduled an emergency assembly, hoping to get ahead of whatever was coming. Chuck didn't attend. Emma did. She stood in the back, arms crossed, eyes steady. Huxley spoke briefly, offering what he called a measured apology. He acknowledged the incident, used words like misunderstanding and unfortunate outcome. But Emma didn't flinch. Because by now the truth had already begun to move faster than the spin. Over the next week, more recordings surfaced. Past students sent in projects that had been rejected for bizarre reasons. One boy's portfolio had failed for including cultural elements from his native country. Another girl had been denied scholarship recommendation because her themes were too rooted in identity politics. Chuck gathered it all, compiled, organized. Then, I passed it to the Education Oversight Committee with a single statement. These are not isolated mistakes. This is a culture of erasure dressed as refinement. Soon after, Professor Huxley was placed on administrative leave. An internal investigation began. Chuck didn't celebrate. He wasn't after revenge. He was after reform. The attention brought the media to their door. Emma declined interviews. Chuck answered only a few, always focused on the principle, not the drama. "What do you want people to take from this?" one reporter asked. Chuck replied, that dignity doesn't require permission, and that real influence begins with knowing who you are, not who they tell you to be. The message resonated. Across the country, schools began reviewing their appearance codes. Parents asked more questions. Students spoke up. And Chuck? He went back to his workshop. Not to disappear, but to prepare. There was still work to do. But now they weren't doing it alone. The silence had been broken, and the voice that replaced it was steady, strong, and finally heard. The press conference wasn't part of the original plan. Chuck had no interest in public stages, and Emma wasn't looking for a spotlight. But as more voices came forward, as more former students spoke up with stories that echoed hers, the silence around Professor Huxley became too loud to ignore. This wasn't just about one school anymore. It had become a reflection of something much broader, a culture of quiet suppression, dressed as excellent, and it was time someone spoke to it directly. They didn't hire a PR team, no backdrop with logos or branded banners, just a plain wooden podium set up outside the front gates of Orlando Academy. Word had spread quickly. By noon, a crowd had gathered. Parents, teachers, former students, journalists with notepads and cameras, and others who simply wanted to stand and witness something shift. Clint Eastwood arrived quietly, standing near the back. He didn't wave or take questions. He was there to listen. Chuck and Emma stepped out of a black truck and walked toward the podium together. No entourage, no security, just presence.
Emma stood beside her father. She didn't fidget or lower her gaze. The beanie she once wore to hide her hair was gone. In its place, short silver strands glinted in the sun. What had once been a mark of shame had now become something else. A symbol. Chuck began without raising his voice. His tone was steady, like someone telling the truth after a long silence. He spoke about what had happened, about what had been taken, not just from Emma, but from many. He named no one out of malice, only from accountability. When you're in a position of influence and you choose silence over integrity, you become part of the damage. He paused often, letting each word land before continuing. Then he said something that brought the entire crowd to stillness. You don't teach creativity by erasing identity. You don't build discipline by humiliating expression. And you don't earn respect by demanding conformity. You earn it by listening. Emma stepped forward next. Her voice was softer, but no less clear. She didn't speak about anger. She spoke about understanding. How hard it is for a young person to push back when someone older, someone in authority, says, "You're too much, too bright, too different." She said she never wanted anyone else to sit in silence because they thought they were alone. She said she stood there today so someone else wouldn't have to. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They listened. Really listened. Later that evening, the footage began to circulate. News outlets picked it up not for its drama, but for its clarity. No shouting, no protest signs, just a father and daughter standing up, not against a person, but against a mindset. And yet the school board tried to take control of the narrative. They released a statement claiming the matter had been addressed internally, that Orlander remained committed to artistic integrity and inclusive practices. But their words rang hollow, because in the days that followed, more and more past students posted their stories. Some included screenshots of emails, copies of critiques, graded portfolios with comments that cut deeper than any red mark ever should. Words like disjointed, not culturally universal, and too personal. These weren't artistic notes. They were dismissals of identity. Chuck didn't respond to the board directly. He knew better than to argue with people trying to preserve their image. Instead, he focused on the truth. He met with parents from nearby schools. He sat with teachers who wanted to do better but felt trapped by policy. He gathered examples of programs around the country that promoted inclusive education without sacrificing quality. And he began to build something else. A framework, one that schools could use to train staff on how to engage differences with curiosity, not resistance. One that encouraged critique as growth, not control. One that centered dignity as a foundational value in education, not an optional courtesy. Meanwhile, a journalist from a national magazine reached out to Emma. She didn't want to be featured, but she agreed to one interview on one condition: the piece had to be about the system, not just her. The article went viral, titled "When Excellence Demands Erasure." It sparked national conversation. Teachers from across the country wrote in. Some shared frustration, others admitted regret. Then came the recording. A staff member, still anonymous, leaked an audio file from a faculty meeting where Huxley openly discussed grooming students for prestigious gallery placements. He spoke about visual discipline, about minimizing eccentricities. He mentioned controlling first impressions, not for the students' growth, but to preserve the school's reputation. That was the turning point. The school board could no longer distance itself. Pressure mounted, an independent review was ordered, and for the first time in the school's history, students were invited to participate. Chuck was asked if he wanted a seat on the panel. He declined, but he recommended someone else, a retired professor of ethics and art history who had mentored dozens of artists of color over his career, a man who believed that talent without soul was just decoration. When the review began, it didn't take long to uncover patterns. Disciplinary actions were disproportionately handed out to students who deviated from traditional norms. Portfolios that embraced cultural or emotional themes were more likely to be marked down, and recommendations for scholarships had often followed a narrow, often aesthetic standard. The findings were made public. The impact was immediate. Professor Huxley was officially dismissed not just for the haircut incident, but also for a years-long record of gatekeeping masked as mentorship. The school's head of arts resigned 2 days later. New policies were drafted within the month. However, perhaps the most significant change was the formation of a student oversight committee. For the first time, Orlander students had a structured voice in how their education was shaped. Emma was asked to chair it. She hesitated at first, but Chuck reminded her of something he had once told her as a child. The best way to protect your voice is to use it. She accepted. The first meeting was quiet, a few nervous faces, some skeptical. But as they went around the room, sharing stories, something happened. The fear began to lift. One student talked about being told to paint in neutral tones because bold colors were too aggressive. Another described being told to abandon a project that reflected their grief because it didn't fit the showcase theme. Emma didn't have all the answers, but she listened, and when she spoke, she did so with calm certainty. She said they weren't there to fix everything at once. They were there to keep the truth in the room. That spring, the Academy held its annual art showcase. For the first time in its history, no theme was imposed. Students were told to create whatever moved them. The gallery was filled with color, depth, and stories that made people stop in their tracks. One wall displayed a single quote, voted on by the committee. Art isn't what we're told to be, it's who we already are. Emma's painting was placed at the center of the room, a girl walking down a road made of broken clocks, her silver hair streaming behind her, untouched. Chuck attended the opening quietly. He stood in the back, watched people pause in front of her work, saw them read her artist statement, and nod. Not because they agreed with every brushstroke, but because they felt it. After the show, Clint joined him on a bench outside. He handed Chuck a cup of coffee, then sat in silence for a while. Eventually, he spoke. You didn't just protect her. Chuck didn't look away from the building. What did I do? You reminded a whole lot of people that presence doesn't come from noise, it comes from clarity. Chuck nodded. And clarity, he said, comes from knowing what matters most. For both of them, it was never about taking something down. It was always about helping something better rise in its place. And that kind of influence, the kind that lingers long after the room empties, doesn't come from authority. It comes from integrity. That spring, something shifted, not just in a school, but in how people choose to speak, and more importantly, in how they chose to listen. Emma never imagined her painting would hang in the center of Orlander's grand gallery. She had stood in that space before, quiet and unnoticed, walking past rows of polished frames and carefully curated messages. But this time was different. Her work wasn't just displayed, it was witnessed.
The painting was raw, almost unfinished by traditional standards. A girl stood alone on a long road made of broken clocks. Her silver hair flowed behind her like wind in water. The colors were jarring. Midnight blue next to sharp yellow, deep reds tangled with ash gray. But people stopped in front of it. They didn't talk much. Some cried, some stared.
It wasn't perfect. That wasn't the point. It was honest. Chuck walked through the exhibit later that night, after the crowds had gone. The janitor led him in without a word. He moved slowly through the room, taking in the pieces, not as a critic, as a father, as a man who had seen too much, forced silence passed off his order. He stopped in front of Emma's painting, hands in his pockets, and stood for a long time. Behind him, Clint Eastwood leaned against the doorway. He didn't speak at first, just nodded toward the canvas. "That's not just a painting," he said quietly. "That's a declaration." Chuck gave a soft smile. She earned every stroke. In the days that followed, Emma was invited to speak at forums, panels, and even a national conference on inclusive education. At first, she said no. She wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. But Chuck reminded her that sometimes the most powerful presence in a room is the one who has never asked to be there. It's the one that shows up anyway, with something real to say. So she agreed to one. Just one. The event was in Chicago, a leadership summit for youth and education. Emma took the stage wearing a plain gray jacket, no makeup, short hair, and shining like steel under the lights. She didn't speak from notes. She spoke from memory. She talked about art, about control disguised as guidance, about how easy it is to be shaped by someone else's fear. She told the story of the haircut, yes, but more than that, she told the story of getting back up, of creating anyway, of finding her own voice in the mess. The room was silent, not because they didn't care, but because they did. At the end, a woman in her 60s stood up and said, "Thank you," not as a teacher, as a former student who had once been told to change everything about her writing to be acceptable. That woman wasn't bitter. She was proud because she saw in Emma something she wished she had found earlier in herself. Later, backstage, a producer asked Chuck how he felt seeing his daughter speak like that. He just said, "She's not learning from me anymore, she's leading." Word of Emma's speech spread, not in headlines, in conversations, quiet ones, in faculty lounges, parent groups, and among artists who had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Then came the invitation that surprised them all, the United Nations Youth Assembly, a gathering of young voices around the world speaking on dignity, education, and identity. Emma didn't say yes right away. She thought maybe someone else should go, someone more experienced. Chuck sat with her that night, fire crackling, the dog curled at their feet. "You don't go because you know everything," he said. "You go because you've lived something worth sharing, and you tell it the way only you can." So she accepted. The day of the event, Emma stood behind a tall wooden podium at the UN building in New York. The room was filled with diplomats, students, educators, and leaders from every continent. The walls were lined with flags. But Emma only looked at the faces. She wasn't intimidated. She was ready. She began not with her story, but with a question. What do we lose when we ask children to shrink to fit the shape of our comfort? Then she told them. She described a system that mistakes uniformity for excellence, that trains individuality out of young people to maintain order, that punishes courage when it doesn't look polished. But she didn't stop there. She spoke about rebuilding, about the power of listening, about what it meant to create a place where expression wasn't corrected. It was encouraged. She said something then that stayed with everyone in the room. They shaved my head, but they didn't take my power, because power isn't how loud you are, it's how clearly you stand. When she finished, there was no applause at first, just stillness. Then, slowly, the entire hall rose to its feet. Chuck watched the live stream from home. He didn't need to be in the room. He knew her voice. And he knew what it meant to stand in your own presence without apology. Back at Orlander, things had changed. The new administration had implemented revised policies, dress codes were rewritten, faculty were offered training not in compliance, but in compassion. The Student Oversight Committee became a permanent fixture. And Emma, she led quietly, with consistency, with grace. She never used her story as a weapon, only as a bridge. One afternoon, a freshman approached her in the hallway. He was small, soft-spoken, and held a sketch pad full of wild, brilliant ideas. He said he used to be afraid to show them until he heard her speak and saw her walk through the same halls he had walked, and that maybe, just maybe, there was room for his voice too. Emma smiled, handed him a blank canvas, and told him the same thing her father once told her. Don't ask permission to be yourself, just begin.
And he did.
The ripples didn't stop at Orlander. Across the country, schools began looking inward. Some reached out to Chuck for help. Others invited Emma to speak. But they didn't turn it into a movement with banners or slogans. They just kept showing up. Eventually, Chuck and Emma launched the NET project, Narrative, Expression, Trust, a nonprofit built to support students silenced by academic systems that forgot their role. The mission was simple: help young people tell their stories, build confidence in their expression, and create bridges between voice and leadership. They didn't take corporate sponsors, they didn't build a flashy site, but their workshops filled up within weeks. Teachers who had once felt trapped found new ways to connect. Students who had once hidden their art shared it with pride. And through it all, Chuck remained steady. He never tried to center himself. He stood behind, beside, and sometimes just out of sight, but always present. One evening, Clint visited the small studio where Emma now worked. It was quiet, filled with soft light and unfinished pieces. He walked through, hands in his coat pockets, taking it in. She asked him if he thought all this would last, if people would keep listening. Clint looked at her and said, "You made them see what they were pretending not to." That doesn't go away easily. She nodded, then turned back to her canvas. Later that year, Emma painted a mural on the side of the new community center. It wasn't her, it was a long stretch of clocks, breaking open, revealing seeds, each one growing into something different, some wild, some strange, all alive. Underneath it, she painted a single line. The moment you stop asking for permission, the world changes shape. People came from all over to see it, not because of the name, because of the message. Chuck stood across the street, watching in the early morning quiet. He didn't need to say anything. His presence said enough. The first day back at Orlander felt nothing like the last time Emma had walked those halls. There was no whispering, no staring, no one avoided her eyes. If anything, they met her with quiet nods or small smiles. Some still didn't know what to say, but that didn't matter. She wasn't here for attention. She was here to reclaim something. The school looked the same from the outside, but inside, something had shifted. New posters lined the hallway walls, highlighting student-led exhibitions, feedback circles, and weekly forums for open expression. But even more noticeable than the visuals was the atmosphere. Lighter, more aware, not perfect, but changed. Emma walked slowly, taking it all in. Her steps weren't hesitant anymore. She wasn't carrying the weight of proving anything. She had done that already. Now she was just walking as herself. And that, in this place, was revolutionary. She passed her old locker. Once, it had been a place where she'd found anonymous notes, mocking her hair, her paintings, even her silence. But now, it had been repainted, not by staff, but by students, a quiet tribute. On it were words in different handwriting, phrases like, "Thank you for being brave," and "I finally showed my sketchbook because of you." She reached out and traced the edges with her fingertips. No tears, just a deep breath, and a soft, steady sense of being home. Chuck stood outside, leaning on the fence. He didn't go in. He rarely did. But Emma always knew he was there, watching, not out of worry, out of respect. He trusted her. She had grown into someone who didn't need to be shielded. She had become someone who knew how to carry herself through spaces that once tried to shrink her. Later that week, the school held a quiet gathering, not a celebration or recognition. Students, faculty, and some parents came together to unveil a new plaque in the central courtyard. It was cast in brass, simple, strong. It read, "To those who stood tall when they were told to bow, to those who spoke when they were told to stay silent. Respect before rules."
Emma didn't give a speech. She didn't need to. Just standing there beside Chuck and the new principal, hand on her chest, was enough. Her presence said more than words. After the event, a woman approached them. She looked to be in her late 50s, a parent. She introduced herself as a therapist who had once worked with several students from the school. Quiet ones, talented, some who left early, others who stayed but never thrived. She said, "What you've done here may not erase what was lost, but it's going to keep others from losing more." Then she turned to Emma and added, "You reminded people that stillness doesn't mean weakness, and being different doesn't mean broken." Emma smiled. She didn't always know what to say in moments like that, but her silence had a strength of its own now. It wasn't afraid anymore. A few weeks later, Clint Eastwood returned for a surprise visit. He'd been keeping tabs from afar, but decided it was time to step into the picture again. Not for show, for closure. He requested access to past disciplinary records. The new administration, committed to transparency, allowed it. What they uncovered wasn't shocking, but it was sobering. A pattern of disproportionate enforcement. Hair violations, dress code infractions, suspensions over nonconformity, and they all pointed to the same truth. Too many students, especially from marginalized backgrounds, had been quietly told to make themselves smaller. Clint called for a town hall, no press, just people. The school community showed up in full: teachers, alumni, students. Even the quiet janitor who had watched it all unfold over the years stood near the back, listening closely. Let's be clear. Clint didn't use big words. He didn't stir emotions. He simply said, sometimes systems build walls that are easier to leave alone, until someone reminds us they don't belong there. Then he handed the mic to Emma. She didn't read from a script. She looked around the room and said, "We're not broken. We were silenced, but we're loud now. And we're not leaving." The crowd stood, not with thunder, but with unity. It felt like something ancient had lifted. With the momentum still alive, the school board passed new policies. Dress codes could no longer be used to police culture or identity. Faculty underwent training in restorative dialogue. Students were given regular platforms to offer feedback. And most importantly, a culture of curiosity replaced one of control. Emma continued chairing the student committee, but she also started mentoring younger students who struggled with confidence. She didn't tell them how to speak. She just helped them listen to their own voice until they knew what it sounded like. Chuck kept working behind the scenes. The NET project had expanded into 3 more districts. He never called it a foundation. He called it a place where truth has room to move. He met with principals, counselors, and even district attorneys. He didn't come with demands. He came with stories. And stories changed minds. At the national level, education committees began asking questions. How do we define professionalism in students? Who gets to decide what expression is allowed? And what does dignity look like in a classroom? Chuck didn't have all the answers, but he asked better questions than most. One morning, Emma received a letter from the European Youth Council. They invited her to speak at a cross-cultural education forum in Switzerland. She accepted, not for prestige, for the possibility. She knew her story wasn't just hers anymore. It was part of something larger. At the forum, she spoke beside young leaders from different parts of the world. She shared not only what happened, but what came after. Healing is not a straight line. How growth doesn't mean forgetting, and how power, real power, doesn't shout, it steadies. The message reached thousands. When she returned home, Chuck met her at the gate. Same jacket, same quiet smile. She hugged him longer than usual. That fall, the mural she had painted was selected to be recreated in other schools, not as decoration, as a commitment. Some places called it the Road of Clocks, others just called it the Silver Thread. The quote underneath stayed the same. The moment you stop asking for permission, the world changes shape. By winter, the NET project received a national award for advocacy in education. Emma didn't attend the ceremony. She sent a video instead. She said the goal was never to become a voice for others. The goal was to remind them they already had one. People listened. By the following year, Emma's hair had grown back fully, long, silver. She wore it proudly, pulled back in a loose braid or left flowing, not to make a point, but because it was hers. And when she walked down the hallway at Orlando, no one stared anymore, not because they didn't care, but because she had normalized something that should never have been questioned. That kind of change sticks. Years later, when she was asked how it all began, she never mentioned the haircut first. She said it started when someone mistook silence for weakness, and ended when silence found its strength. Chuck often watched her from afar, proud but never boastful. To him, she was more than resilient. She was a reminder that leadership doesn't always come from the podium. Sometimes it begins in a whisper, in stillness, in a refusal to bend. And if you ask him what he learned from it all, he'll say this: influence isn't about how many people hear you, it's about how many people feel seen when you speak. That's what Emma had become. Not a symbol, a mirror. And the world, finally, had started looking back. Sometimes, the stories that stay with us the longest aren't the loudest ones, they're the quiet moments. A girl refusing to be reshaped, a father standing without shouting, a school is slowly learning how to listen again. What happened to Emma wasn't just about hair, it was about dignity. What happens when someone decides they won't shrink to fit into someone else's version of acceptable? For many of us watching, maybe we've had our own versions of that moment, being told we were too different, too much, not enough. Or maybe we've stayed silent when we should have spoken up. But the beauty of growth is it's never too late. Whether you're 16 or 65, presence doesn't come from perfection. It comes from knowing what you stand for and standing there with both feet on the ground. Emma's story reminds us of something simple but powerful. You don't need to raise your voice to make an impact. You just need to stand in your truth. That's the kind of influence that lasts. That's the kind of leadership that doesn't fade with time. If this story moved something in you, let it keep moving. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about a time when you found your voice, or wish you had. And if you'd like more stories that inspire reflection, courage, and calm strength, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes, the right story at the right time doesn't just change how you feel, it reminds you of who you really are, and that reminder, especially at this stage in life, might be the most powerful thing of all.